12 years of loyalty evaporated in exactly 12 seconds. That's how long it took for my boss to smile and hand the VP title I earned to his nephew, a kid whose only qualification was his last name. I didn't flip the table. I didn't scream. I simply asked for my new job description in writing. See, they thought they were putting me in my place. They didn't realize that by forcing me to follow the rules, they were handing me the matches to burn the whole place down. Before I tell you how my malicious compliance cost them $5 million in a single weekend, let me know in the comments. Has a boss ever asked you to train the person who took your job? And if you're ready to see a toxic workplace get exactly what it deserves, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the crash. My name is Rowan Kincaid, and for the last 12 years, I have been the invisible spine of Stratos Logistics, serving as the lead operations architect for a company that specializes in the transport of volatile medical isotopes. My job was never to be seen. My job was to ensure that life-saving cancer treatments moved from a reactor in Europe to a hospital in Chicago without fluctuating in temperature by more than half a degree. It requires a level of precision that does not allow for mistakes, and for over a decade, I provided that precision. I was 41 years old, sitting in a glass-walled conference room with the rain hammering against the windows, waiting for the recognition that I had been promised for 6 months. The Vice President of Operations position was open, and I had been doing the work of that role since the previous executive retired. I had the metrics, the seniority, and the absolute trust of the warehouse staff. I sat there with a binder full of cost-saving projections, ready to accept the title that would finally match my responsibilities. Gavin Halloway, the regional director, walked into the room with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He was a man who understood golf handicaps better than he understood supply chain logistics, but he knew how to manage upwards. He sat down, smoothed his tie, and didn't look at the binder I had prepared. Instead, he looked at the empty chair next to me. Before I could ask, the door opened again, and a young man walked in. He looked about 25, wearing a suit that was slightly too expensive for a first job, with the eager, unscarred face of someone who had never had to tell a client that their critical shipment was lost. This was Tanner, Gavin's nephew. I knew him from company picnics, the kid who had just graduated with a degree in general business management. Gavin gestured for Tanner to sit, and then he dropped the guillotine without even blinking. He told me that while my technical skills were invaluable, the board felt the department needed a fresh, modern energy for the vice president role. He told me that Tanner would be stepping into the position effective immediately, bringing a digital-first mindset that they felt I lacked. I did not scream. I did not throw my binder. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the drumming rain. I looked at Gavin, then at Tanner, who at least had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. Gavin continued speaking, filling the silence with corporate platitudes about synergy and mentorship. He explained that my new role would be Senior Associate, a title that sounded important but carried zero authority, and that my primary responsibility for the next 90 days would be to onboard Tanner. Essentially, they wanted me to download 12 years of institutional knowledge into the brain of a novice so that he could successfully be my boss. A cold clarity washed over me. It was a physical sensation, like stepping out of a warm house into freezing winter air. I realized that my value to them was not my leadership, but my utility. I was the engine, and they had just decided to put a fresh coat of paint on the hood and call it a new car. I understand, I said, my voice steady, level, and devoid of the emotion Gavin was clearly expecting. I closed my binder. If Tanner is to be the vice president of operations, then we need to ensure the transition is seamless. To do that, I will need a revised job description for my role as senior associate. I need to know exactly where my authority ends and his begins. Gavin looked relieved, mistaking my professionalism for submission. He nodded enthusiastically, pulling a document from his folder. He had it ready. He had expected me to negotiate, to beg, or to quit. He had not expected me to ask for the rules. He slid the paper across the table. It was standard boilerplate language, significantly restricting my access. It stated clearly that the senior associate was an advisory role, responsible for execution but not for high-level authorization, system overrides, or budget approval. I read it twice. Then I looked at Gavin. So, to be clear, I am no longer authorized to approve emergency system overrides or modify routing protocols without direct written approval from the vice president? Gavin laughed, a dismissive sound. Rowan, don't be dramatic. We just need you to support Tanner. But yes, technically, Tanner makes the calls now. We need a single point of authority. Technically is a dangerous word to use with an engineer. I signed the document. I stood up, shook Tanner's hand, which was clammy and limp, and walked out of the conference room. As I walked down the hallway, passing the rows of cubicles where logistics coordinators were frantically managing global shipments, I didn't feel the crushing weight of disappointment I thought I would. I felt light. For 12 years, I had been carrying the weight of this entire infrastructure on my shoulders, catching mistakes before they happened, smoothing over cracks in the system, and working unpaid overtime to ensure Stratos Logistics maintained its 99% success rate. Gavin had just taken that weight off my shoulders and placed it squarely on Tanner's. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and unlocked my workstation. It was time to clean house. The first thing I did was open the back end of our logistics interface. Over the years, I had written dozens of custom scripts, small, automated programs that I ran from my personal user profile to patch the holes in the company's outdated software. These scripts weren't official company property. They were my own intellectual property, tools I built to make my own life easier. They automatically reformatted data from European suppliers. They flagged temperature anomalies before the alarm threshold was reached, and they auto-filled complex customs declarations for hazardous materials. I selected the folder named Rowan, Tools. I hovered my mouse over the delete button. This wasn't sabotage. Sabotage would be breaking the system. This was simply removing the unauthorized modifications I had made to do a job I no longer had. I was merely returning the system to its factory settings, just as my new job description implied. I clicked delete. Then I emptied the recycle bin. Almost immediately, the hum of the office changed. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, but a vibration you could feel. The smooth flow of data on the main dashboard stuttered. A loading bar that usually took 3 seconds now took 30. I could see heads popping up over cubicle walls, confusion rippling through the room. I ignored it. I opened my email and navigated to the settings. I turned off the forwarding rule that sent emergency alerts to my personal cell phone. For a decade, my phone had been a leash, buzzing at 2 in the morning whenever a truck broke down in Nevada or a plane was delayed in Munich. I deleted the rule. Then, I opened the Human Resources portal and logged my hours for the week. It was 4:55 p.m. I spent the next 5 minutes organizing my pens. At 5 p.m. exactly, I put on my coat. Rowan? It was Tanner. He was standing at the edge of my cubicle, holding a tablet, looking frantic. Hey, the dashboard is acting weird. It's super slow, and I can't find the shortcut for the Munich report. Gavin said you have a workaround for the data formatting? I smiled at him, a polite, professional smile. Hello, Tanner. Congratulations again on the promotion. Regarding the dashboard, I removed some personal configuration files that were not part of the official system build. As for the Munich report, the manual procedure is outlined in the Standard Operating Procedure Handbook, Section 4. It involves manually retyping the manifest data into the spreadsheet. Tanner stared at me. Manually? But that will take hours. The team says it usually happens automatically. It happened automatically because I created a script to do it, I explained gently. But as a senior associate, I'm not authorized to deploy custom code on the server. It's a security risk. You'll need to have the IT department build an official tool, which usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks for approval. Until then, the team will have to type it in. But the shipment leaves in 2 hours, Tanner said, his voice pitching up. Then they better start typing, I said. Have a good evening, Tanner. I walked past him, past the confused team, and out into the rain. It was the first time I had left the office while the sun was still theoretically up in years. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, and watched the building lights flicker in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel guilty. I felt like a person who had finally stopped holding up a collapsing ceiling. The next morning, the friction began to turn into heat. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, not a minute earlier. The office was chaotic. The team looked exhausted. Clearly, they had been there late, manually entering the data that my scripts used to handle. Gavin was nowhere to be seen. He often took Fridays off for networking, which usually meant golf. That left Tanner alone at the helm. Around 10:30 a.m., the first real crisis hit. Stratos Logistics handled Class 7 radioactive materials, which meant our customs paperwork had to be flawless. A shipment of Iridium-192 was stuck at customs in JFK Airport in New York. The customs officer was demanding a specific hazardous material handling code that was missing from the digital manifest. "Rowan!" Tanner yelled across the room, abandoning all professional decorum. He jogged over to my desk, phone pressed to his ear. "I have the customs broker on the line. They're holding the Iridium. They say we're missing the hazmat declaration code. Where is it?" I continued typing an email, not looking up immediately. "The code is generated by the compliance officer," I said. That used to be me, unofficially. But in my new job description, I don't have signature authority for Class 7 materials. "You do." "I don't know the code," Tanner hissed, covering the mouthpiece of the phone. "Just tell me what it is." "I can't just tell you," I said, finally turning to face him. "It's not a static number. It's calculated based on the isotope's decay rate and the container's shielding thickness. If I give you the wrong number and we get audited, I lose my license. You need to calculate it using the table in the Federal Regulations binder." Tanner looked at the wall of binders on the shelf as if they were written in Sanskrit. "I don't have time for that. The plane leaves in 40 minutes. If we miss the flight, the isotope decays too much and becomes useless. Just fix it, Rowan. Please." "I cannot fix it," I said, my voice calm but firm. My access to the customs portal was revoked when my role changed. Even if I calculated the number, I can't input it. "You have to log in with your vice president credentials and enter it yourself," Tanner swore under his breath. He ran back to his office, presumably to frantically search Google for how to calculate radioactive decay. I watched him go. A few minutes later, I received an email from Gavin. The subject line was, "Urgent, support Tanner." The body of the email read, "Rowan, I'm hearing there are hiccups. I expect you to step in and resolve these operational blocks. We are a team. Do not hide behind paperwork." I replied immediately, copying the Human Resources Director, Patrice. "Dear Gavin, I am fully supporting Tanner by directing him to the correct regulatory procedures. As per the job description you signed on Tuesday, I am strictly prohibited from executing high-level compliance overrides. Entering customs data under another person's credentials is a federal crime. I am ensuring Stratos Logistics remains compliant with the law." Gavin didn't reply, but 10 minutes later, the system log showed that Tanner had entered a code. I checked it against the chart in my head. It was wrong. He had guessed, or he had used a generic code for low-level medical waste, not high-grade industrial isotopes. I could have stopped him. I could have run into his office and pulled the keyboard away. But I stayed in my chair. I was an observer now. I took a screenshot of the log entry showing Tanner's username and the incorrect code, saved it to a USB drive, and continued my work. By the afternoon, the atmosphere in the office was toxic. The shipment had cleared customs likely because the agent was overworked and didn't check closely, but I knew that when it arrived in Europe, the discrepancies would trigger a secondary inspection. That, however, was a problem for the future. The immediate problem was the temperature control grid. Our trucks and containers were monitored by a central server that adjusted cooling units in real time. If a truck in Arizona got too hot, the server ramped up the AC. If a container in Iceland got too cold, it adjusted the heater. My old scripts used to monitor this traffic and smooth out the data spikes. Without them, the server was getting overwhelmed by raw data. False alarms were pinging every few minutes, warning of temperature breaches that weren't actually happening. "Turn it off," Tanner yelled from his office door. "The alarms are driving me crazy. I can't think." "Sal," The warehouse foreman, a man in his 60s who had seen everything, walked up to my desk. He looked worried. "Rowan," he said quietly, "the kid is talking about disabling the safety shutoffs. He thinks the sensors are broken because they keep pinging. You know they aren't broken. The system is just lagging." "I know, Sal," I said. "If he disables the safety shutoffs, we won't know if a container actually fails," Sal said. "We have a shipment of temperature-sensitive vaccines leaving the loading dock at 4 p.m. if the cooling unit fails and the alarm is off." "I know," I repeated. "But he is the vice president." I advised him in the morning meeting that the system latency was due to the removal of unauthorized patches. He chose to ignore that. "He's going to melt the product," Sal said grimly. "Then tell him," I said. Sal shook his head and walked toward Tanner's office. I watched through the glass. I saw Sal gesturing, explaining. I saw Tanner shaking his head, looking frustrated, pointing at the screaming dashboard. Then I saw Tanner sit down at his computer. A moment later, the alarm stopped. The office went quiet. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. People could work again. But on my screen, I saw the status command reading, "Global Safety Override. Enabled. Audio alarms. Disabled." Tanner hadn't just muted the sound. He had told the system to stop flagging errors entirely to clear the board. He had put tape over the check engine light. At 3:45 p.m., Gavin called the office line. He was put through to speakerphone in the bullpen so the whole team could hear his pep talk. "Great work handling the noise, Tanner." Gavin's voice boomed. "I knew you'd find a way to cut through the clutter. That's the fresh perspective we needed. Don't let the old guard slow you down with their constant worrying about protocols." I sat there, staring at my monitor. The old guard. The people who knew that clutter was actually data. At 4 p.m., the vaccine shipment Sal had worried about was loaded onto truck 404. It was a $3 million shipment bound for a distribution center in Atlanta. The truck pulled away from the dock. On the dashboard, the icon for truck 404 was green. Everything looked perfect, but because the safety override was on, the system wasn't actually polling the truck's internal sensor. It was just displaying the last known good status. I knew that truck 404 had a finicky compressor. It needed a specific software handshake to kick in after the engine started. Usually, my script forced that handshake. Today, there was no script. And there was no alarm. I opened an email draft addressed to Gavin, Tanner, and Patrice from HR with the subject line, "Formal concern regarding safety override." The body read, "I am writing to formally document my objection to the disabling of the global safety override at 2:30 p.m. today. This action removes our visibility into real-time thermal excursions. As per my current role, I cannot reverse this action, but I advise immediate restoration of safety protocols." I hit send. I printed a copy. I put it in my bag. At 4:55 p.m., I packed up my things. The office was peaceful. Tanner was leaning back in his chair, looking satisfied, scrolling through his phone, likely thinking he had successfully navigated his first crisis. He had silenced the noise. He didn't realize that the noise was the system screaming for help. "Rowan," Tanner called out as I walked toward the elevator. "Thanks for the email, I saw it. Don't worry so much. I'm monitoring it manually. Everything is green. See?" He turned his monitor to show me the sea of green icons. "Green just means no signal when you're in override mode, Tanner," I said, almost feeling pity for him. "It defaults to safe when it can't read the data." "No, it doesn't," he scoffed. "It means it's good. Have a good weekend." As the doors closed, I checked my watch. It was 5:01 p.m. on a Friday. The truck was about 10 miles away by now. If the compressor hadn't started, the internal temperature of the container would be rising by about 1 degree every 10 minutes. By Monday morning, the vaccines wouldn't just be warm. They would be toxic soup. But that wasn't my problem. My problem was what to cook for dinner. I spent the weekend gardening. I didn't check my email. I didn't check the company's Slack. I kept my phone on silent. It was the most peaceful weekend I had experienced in a decade. But underneath the calm, there was a deep, cold knot of anticipation. I knew physics, I knew thermodynamics, and I knew that Stratos Logistics was currently flying blind into a mountain. Monday morning arrived with a deceptively sunny sky. I pulled into the parking lot at 8:55 a.m. I noticed something immediately. Gavin's car was there. Gavin never came in before 10 a.m. on a Monday. And next to it was a black sedan with government plates. I walked into the building. The receptionist, usually cheerful, looked pale. She didn't say good morning, she just nodded nervously toward the operations floor. I swiped my badge and entered the main room. It was a disaster scene. Not a physical one, papers weren't flying, but an emotional and operational blast crater. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Every single person was hunched over their keyboards, typing frantically. In the center of the room, the glass walls of the VP's office were blinds closed, but I could hear muffled shouting. I walked to my desk and sat down. My monitor flickered to life. I had 47 unread emails. The first one was a system alert from Sunday night, finally breaking through the override. Critical failure. Truck 404. Total thermal loss. The second email was from the client, accusing us of negligence. The third was from legal. I took a sip of my coffee. The door to the VP's office burst open. Gavin stormed out, his face a color of purple I had never seen before. Tanner trailed behind him, looking like he had aged 10 years in 2 days. He was holding a stack of papers, his hands shaking. "Rowan!" Gavin bellowed across the room. "Get in here! Now!" The entire office froze. I slowly set down my coffee cup. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward them. I didn't rush. I entered the office. Sitting at the conference table was a woman in a sharp gray suit, the auditor from the client's insurance company, alongside an inspector from the regulatory board. "Sit down," Gavin snapped. He turned to the inspectors. "This is Rowan Kincaid. She was responsible for the transition. She was supposed to be supervising the safety protocols." I sat down. I looked at the inspector. I looked at Gavin. "The shipment is destroyed," Gavin said, his voice trembling with rage. $3 million in inventory. And we are being cited for falsifying safety data because the alarms were disabled. Tanner says you didn't train him on how the sensors worked. He says you sabotaged the monitoring script. "I did not sabotage anything," I said, my voice calm, cutting through the heat in the room. I removed unauthorized personal files to comply with the security standards of my new role. "You let the truck leave," Tanner cried out, his voice cracking. "You knew the compressor was tricky. You didn't say anything." "I sent you an email at 4 p.m. on Friday," I said. "Formal concern regarding safety override." "Did you read it?" Tanner froze. He looked at Gavin. "And regarding the supervision?" I continued, turning to the insurance auditor. "I have a signed document here." I pulled the folded paper from my notebook, the job description Gavin had so arrogantly signed the week before. "This document, signed by the regional director, specifically removes my authority to override the vice president's decisions regarding system safety settings. Vice President Tanner disabled the alarms. I advised against it in writing. He overruled me. I followed the rules." The auditor reached out her hand. "May I see that document?" I slid it across the table. Gavin watched the paper move like it was a live grenade. He knew, in that moment, that he had handed me the weapon that was about to end him. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was absolute. It was the silence of a structure that had finally, inevitably collapsed. "This job description," the auditor said, looking up over her glasses, "states that Miss Kincaid is explicitly forbidden from intervening in executive system commands. If she had reactivated the alarms, she would have been in breach of her contract and liable for insubordination." She looked at Gavin. "You effectively fired your safety net, Mr. Halloway, and then you drove the car off a cliff. But not as a senior associate, and not for this salary." The auditor looked at me with a hint of a smile. She understood. This wasn't just about a broken truck. This was about the cost of arrogance. And the bill had just come due. The silence that descended upon the conference room was not merely the absence of noise, it was the crushing weight of reality settling onto the shoulders of men who had spent their careers avoiding it. The insurance auditor, a woman whose job was to calculate the cost of human error, did not look at me. Her gaze was fixed entirely on Gavin Holloway, who was staring at the signed job description on the glass table as if it were a radioactive isotope that had just breached containment. For the first time in his corporate life, Gavin's ability to spin a narrative, to charm, to deflect, was rendered utterly useless because the narrative was printed in black and white, bearing his own signature in blue ink. The regulatory inspector, a man with gray hair and the weary demeanor of someone who had spent 20 years investigating industrial negligence, leaned forward. The leather of his chair creaked loudly in the stillness. He placed his hands flat on the table and asked a single, devastating question, directing it not to me, nor to Gavin, but to Tanner. He asked if the Vice President of Operations understood the legal distinction under Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations between a system error and a safety protocol. Tanner opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him completely. He looked at Gavin for help, a reflex born of nepotism. But Gavin was currently watching his own career disintegrate in real time and could offer no salvation. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not tap my pen. I simply sat with my hands folded on my lap, the perfect picture of the compliant, submissive employee they had demanded I become, letting the silence do the violence for me. The next hour was a slow, methodical dissection of incompetence that felt less like a corporate meeting and more like an autopsy. The auditor turned to me, her voice sharp and professional, and asked if I had documentation of the warnings I claimed to have issued regarding the system override. I nodded slowly, deliberately. I reached into my bag and produced the USB drive, placing it on the glass table with a soft, deliberate click that echoed in the room. I explained that inside were the time-stamped logs of every override command executed in the last 72 hours, alongside the email chain where I had explicitly, formally warned against disabling the thermal alarms. I told them that I had archived these logs as part of the transition process to ensure that the new leadership had a clear, unalterable record of their decisions. Connecting my laptop to the main projector, I did not present a defense, I presented the truth. The room watched in stunned silence as I pulled up the email from Friday afternoon. The subject line, "Formal Concern Regarding Safety Override," was projected onto the wall in 10-foot-high letters, looming over Tanner like a judgment. Underneath it was Gavin's reply, commanding me not to hide behind paperwork. The auditor read the emails out loud, her voice devoid of emotion, which made the words sound even more damning. She read the section where I warned that thermal visibility would be lost. She read the section where Tanner replied that the alarms were just noise. Every sentence was a nail in the coffin, and simply by having saved the correspondence, I was the one holding the hammer. The climax of the meeting arrived not with a shout, but with a security protocol. The chief executive officer of Stratos Logistics joined the meeting via an encrypted video conference link from the headquarters in Zurich. His face on the screen was grim, illuminated by the harsh light of a European evening. He did not ask for explanations. The evidence projected on the wall was explanation enough. He listened to the auditor's summary, which concluded that the incident was not accidental but a result of gross executive negligence authorized by the regional director. The inspector added that by disabling the alarms to improve his working environment, Tanner had not only destroyed $3 million of pharmaceutical inventory, but had also violated the terms of the company's operating license, exposing the firm to federal prosecution. The CEO spoke only 3 sentences. He stated that Gavin Holloway was placed on immediate unpaid suspension pending a legal review. He stated that Tanner was terminated effective immediately for cause. And he requested that security escort them from the building to ensure no data was tampered with. I watched as they were asked to surrender their badges. There was a moment of profound, poetic irony when Tanner the boy brought in to bring fresh energy and digital agility to the department looked at me with tears welling in his eyes, finally realizing that the old guard he had mocked was the only structural integrity the department had ever had. Gavin did not look at me. He gathered his expensive fountain pen and his leather folio with shaking hands. The arrogance finally drained out of him, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a middle manager who had bet everything on bloodlines and lost. As they were marched out of the glass doors by the building security, the office floor fell silent. The staff, who had been watching through the blinds, didn't cheer. They were too terrified. They knew that the ship had hit an iceberg, and the captain had just been thrown overboard. The aftermath was a vacuum of power and capability. For the next 48 hours, the operations department of Stratos Logistics effectively ceased to function. Without a vice president to authorize movements, and with the system still in a state of critical failure due to the manual override, no trucks moved, no planes were loaded. The logistics board remained a sea of gray icons, indicating a disconnected fleet. The company was bleeding money at a rate of $50,000 an hour in contractual penalties, rush shipping fees to competitors, and lost trust. I went back to my desk, but I did not touch the keyboard to fix it. I sat there, fulfilling my role as senior associate to the letter. I watered the small succulent plant on my desk. I organized my physical files. I answered the phone only to say, "I am not authorized to make that decision. Please refer to the regional office." The remaining managers were paralyzed, afraid to make a decision that might lead to another catastrophe, terrified of the federal auditors roaming the halls. The client, Medcor, announced publicly that they were reviewing their entire contract with us. The stock price of Stratos Logistics dipped by 12% on Tuesday morning when the news of the regulatory breach leaked to the business press. I waited. I knew the physics of corporate desperation. I knew that the silence from headquarters wouldn't last. They were running the numbers. They were realizing that the cost of fixing the system was high, but the cost of losing the operating license was fatal. And most importantly, they were realizing that there was only one person in the building, perhaps in the world, who knew the encryption key to the custom scripts that could bring the network back to life. On Wednesday morning, the phone on my desk rang. It was not the internal line used by colleagues. It was the priority line, the one that bypassed the receptionist. I picked it up on the second ring. "Rowan Kincaid speaking," I said, my voice calm. The voice on the other end was accented, serious, and familiar. It was the CEO. He asked me to come up to the executive suite, which had been empty and dark since Gavin's departure. When I walked in, the air was stale. The screen on the wall was active, showing the CEO in his office in Zurich. He looked tired. The crisis had clearly cost him sleep. He didn't waste time with small talk or apologies. He admitted that mistakes had been made. He admitted that the decision to replace me had been based on flawed data and poor judgment from regional leadership. He told me that the board of directors had authorized him to reinstate me as the vice president of operations, effective immediately. He offered a 20% salary increase, a reinstatement of my full benefits, and a written apology to be placed in my file. It was the victory I had wanted on that rainy Tuesday. It was the validation of 12 years of invisible labor. It was the title, the money, and the power. It was everything I should have wanted. But as I looked at the man on the screen, I felt a shift in my own internal architecture. The trust was broken. If I accepted the job as an employee, I would still be a subordinate. I would still be subject to their whims, their budget cuts, their quarterly reviews, and their future attempts to replace me with someone cheaper once the crisis had passed. I thought about the job description I had forced Gavin to sign. I thought about the freedom of the last week, the cold clarity of just following the rules without emotional attachment. I realized I didn't want to be their employee anymore. I didn't want to be the safety net they could fold up and put away when the sun was shining. I wanted to be the ground they walked on. I wanted to be untouchable. "I appreciate the offer, sir," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty office. "But I cannot accept the position of vice president." The CEO frowned, clearly surprised. He began to talk about stock options, about a signing bonus, thinking it was a standard negotiation for money. I let him finish his pitch. Then I spoke, cutting through the noise. "The issue isn't the salary. The issue is the structure. You built a system that relied on one person to fix the mistakes of everyone else, and when that person stopped, the system collapsed. If I come back as an employee, nothing changes. In 2 years, another Gavin will appear, another Tanner will be hired, and I will be expected to clean up the mess again. I paused, letting the reality sink in across the ocean. I won't return as an employee. However, I am willing to return as an external consultant. The CEO went silent. He understood exactly what I was saying, and he understood the danger of it. An employee is a subordinate who can be fired. A consultant is a peer who must be paid. "What are your terms?" he asked, his voice guarded. I slid a folder across the desk towards the camera, even though he couldn't physically take it, a symbolic gesture that the paperwork was ready. "I will form an independent limited liability company, Kincaid Systems. Stratos Logistics will hire my firm on a 12-month retainer to restructure the entire operations grid. My fee will be $300 an hour with a guaranteed minimum of 40 hours a week. I will have absolute authority over technical hiring and firing within the operations department. I will report directly to the board, bypassing regional management entirely, and most importantly," I leaned in closer to the microphone. "My custom automation scripts, the code that actually runs your business, remain my intellectual property, licensed to you strictly for the duration of the contract. If the contract ends, the scripts go with me." The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. The cost was triple what they had paid me as a salaried manager. The power dynamic was completely inverted. But as we both knew, the cost of not hiring me was the total collapse of their North American supply chain. The CEO looked at the numbers on his screen. He looked at the empty seat where Gavin used to sit, the seat of a man who had cost them millions. He knew he had no leverage. The fresh energy had burned the house down. He needed the architect to rebuild the foundation, and he had to pay the architect's price. "Send the contract to legal," he said finally, his voice resigned. "We will sign it by end of day. Can you get the thermal grid back online tonight?" "I can," I said, "once the contract is countersigned and the retainer is wired." I walked out of the executive suite not as a vice president, but as the president of my own future. That afternoon, the contract was signed, and the notification of the wire transfer hit my phone. I returned to my desk not to pack, but to work. The first thing I did was call a meeting with the warehouse staff. Sal was there, looking tired but hopeful. I told them the new rules. No more shortcuts. No more ignored alarms. I told them that from now on, safety was the only metric that mattered, and anyone who tried to override a protocol would answer to me, and I answered to no one but the physics of the job. Then, I sat down at my workstation. I plugged in the backup drive. I opened the folder labeled Rowan Tools. I reinstalled the scripts. I reactivated the safety protocols. At 6 p.m., for the first time in a week, the main dashboard flickered. The jagged red lines smoothed out. The gray icons of the trucks turned green, a real, vibrant green that meant the sensors were active and the data was true. The hum of the servers returned, a steady, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat returning to a body that had flatlined. The office felt different. It wasn't the frantic energy of before, nor the terrified silence of the crash. It was the calm, heavy atmosphere of competence. I stood up and put on my coat. I didn't stay late. I didn't need to. The system was running because I had built it to run, and now I was finally being paid what that construction was worth. As I walked to the elevator, I looked back at the empty office of the vice president. I didn't want that chair. I realized that the most powerful position in the room wasn't the one with the title, it was the one with the keys. And as the elevator doors closed, I finally allowed myself a small, quiet smile. My victory proves that the loudest move isn't always a scream. Sometimes, it's simply stepping back and letting the consequences speak for themselves. My silence wasn't weakness. In the right hands, it was a devastating strategy. To anyone who has ever quietly withdrawn their extra effort from a place that refused to value it, remember, you aren't giving up, you are leveling up. Never apologize for charging full price for your worth. If my story resonated with your own battle, please like, comment, and share it with someone who is still finding the courage to say no.